After that winter, certain injuries never healed. The paperwork continued, as if nothing unusual had occurred. What changed during that period was treated as final. The reassignment arrived folded inside a routine notice, stamped and initialed like hundreds before it. She wasn't selected. Her name had simply been moved from one column to another, effective within hours. The form listed equipment, room numbers, and a reminder to return unused supplies, as if the outcome had already been calculated. Others had signed theirs earlier. The schedule allowed no space for refusal, only a line indicating where absence would be logged. Whatever followed noncompliance had already been prepared. She was brought inside without being told where she was, only where not to stand. The floor reflected light unevenly, polished in some places and worn thin in others, as if people had learned exactly where to stop moving. The air felt stale but not old, circulated, managed, intentionally reused. Time stretched without markers, no clock, no window, no cue to begin or end anything. Waiting stopped feeling temporary and started feeling instructional. Nothing was posted, yet everything seemed regulated. Chairs were used but never moved. Papers were handled but never stacked the same way twice. She noticed how long hands hovered before touching surfaces, how footsteps softened near certain thresholds. These weren't habits taught aloud, they were inherited, absorbed by watching what didn't draw attention. The absence of correction felt more controlling than orders ever could. People passed close enough to register body heat, but their gazes slid past faces as if faces created risk. When eyes accidentally met, the moment ended too quickly, not in fear but in recognition. No one looked lost, they looked trained. Even stillness had posture. She realized that being noticed wasn't dangerous, being remembered was. The building wasn't quiet, it hummed, breathed, pulsed faintly through vents and wiring. But the sound never changed, and that consistency pressed inward. When a distant noise finally broke the pattern, no one reacted, as if reacting would give it weight. Silence stopped feeling empty and started feeling supervised. It wasn't the lack of sound that unsettled her, it was how perfectly everyone fit inside it. She didn't ask anything. Still, pauses lengthened after certain glances. Responses, when they came, arrived slower, flatter, adjusted. Nothing punitive happened, yet something recalibrated. It became clear that curiosity didn't interrupt the system, it fed it. The environment wasn't waiting to be understood, it was watching to see how she tried. At first, the changes were too small to argue with. Morning routines still existed, but they ended earlier than expected, not by instruction, just by consensus. People stopped waiting for certain confirmations. One task that had always required two signatures now required one, though no memo reflected the adjustment. It felt less like a decision and more like erosion. A sound that had marked transitions, not loud, not important, just familiar, didn't occur one morning. No one checked the time. No one mentioned it. The absence passed unnoticed, which made it noticeable. Something that was supposed to happen every day didn't happen again. Not postponed. Not replaced. Simply removed. The schedule still showed the slot, empty but preserved, like a placeholder no one intended to fill. The routine continued around it, bending slightly, as if everyone had agreed not to step there anymore. No explanation arrived, because none was requested. What unsettled her wasn't the change itself. Systems change all the time, but how quickly the body adapted. Muscles adjusted. Expectations shrank. Attention rerouted. The mind filled gaps with efficiency instead of curiosity. It wasn't chaos. It was quiet reoptimization. By the end of that period, the absence felt older than it was. Time stopped behaving properly. Days no longer separated cleanly, they overlapped, repeated, dissolved into one another. Shifts ended without clear closure. Start times drifted. Notes were written, crossed out, rewritten in margins already crowded with corrections. Records still existed, just thinner. Details that had once been standard became optional. Measurements were rounded, descriptions shortened. Language softened until it carried no texture at all. What had once been recorded as observation was now summarized as outcome. The accumulation wasn't loud. It was subtractive. People began remembering things that didn't appear on paper and forgetting things that did. Memory and documentation slowly swapped authority. When discrepancies surfaced, the document always won, not because it was correct, but because it was complete. Absences started to matter more than presence. A missing entry carried more weight than a recorded one. A blank line suggested a decision already made. The absence of a name implied resolution. Silence in the logbook began to feel intentional. She noticed that no one flipped back through older pages anymore. Everything important was assumed to be current. History compressed into the most recent version, revised just enough to feel accurate. What was being built wasn't a record, it was a surface. And surfaces are easier to clean. The confirmation didn't arrive as an announcement. It arrived as a pause. A name was skipped during a routine check, not misread, not corrected. The reader hesitated, moved on, and continued as if the omission were expected. No one looked up. No one asked for clarification. The pause lasted less than a second. The implication lasted longer. Later, a rule shifted, not rewritten, just adjusted. A posture requirement softened. A duration shortened. A procedural note added in pencil instead of ink. The change was subtle enough to feel provisional, but it stayed. One behavior changed quietly across the room. People stopped lingering. Tasks were completed with immediate exit. No one stayed longer than necessary. Conversations ended earlier. Stillness, once tolerated, became inefficient. At some point, she realized the environment no longer reacted to behavior. It anticipated it. That's when the line became visible. Not the line of harm. The line of normalization. Whatever had happened didn't need defending anymore. It had passed into process. It existed inside adjustments, not actions. The system wasn't hiding something, it was absorbing it. And absorption is irreversible. From that moment on, nothing new had to occur for the change to persist. The lock was already engaged. They arrived weeks later, scattered and uneven, not as events but as inconveniences. Small discrepancies surfaced during routine reviews, numbers that didn't align, summaries that felt unfamiliar. Nothing alarming enough to escalate, nothing dramatic enough to demand correction. That was the point. A report referenced an outcome, no one recalled documenting. A notation appeared without a corresponding observation. A conclusion existed without a visible process. At first, it felt like oversight. Then repetition removed that comfort. Memory began to feel unreliable, not because it failed, but because it conflicted with what was written. When two versions of reality emerged, the written one always prevailed. Not through argument, through convenience. Paper didn't hesitate. People did. Over time, staff stopped trusting recollection. It took longer, required justification, introduced friction. Documentation was faster, smoother, already approved. So memory yielded. One file was requested more than once. It wasn't marked confidential. It wasn't listed as destroyed. It wasn't archived. It simply wasn't there. The request was processed politely each time. The response remained consistent, pending, delayed, under review. No urgency, no denial, just motion without arrival. Eventually, the request stopped being submitted. Not because it was resolved, but because the absence became familiar. Staff learned which questions stalled workflow. They adapted. The missing document didn't raise suspicion anymore. It raised inconvenience. And inconvenience is easy to avoid. Paperwork continued to accumulate. Forms were completed more efficiently now. Fewer handwritten notes, more standardized language, descriptions reduced to categories, outcomes compressed into checkmarks. Nuance disappeared first. Details that once felt necessary became optional. Language shifted from observation to assessment, from description to classification. What mattered was what happened, but how it was filed. When discrepancies arose, the solution was never investigation. It was revision. Records were updated to match one another, not to match memory. Consistency became the goal. Accuracy became implied. And because the revisions were small, no single change felt dishonest. Together they felt final. One procedure was quietly adjusted. The revision was framed as efficiency, comfort, streamlining. No incident prompted it, no complaint preceded it. The change arrived already approved. The old procedure wasn't removed, it was deprecated, left in manuals but no longer practiced. New staff learned the revision first. Older staff adapted without comment. Over time, the original process stopped feeling real. Not because it was forbidden, but because it was unnecessary. Habit replaced history. Those who remembered the earlier routines didn't discuss them. Not out of fear, out of habit. Specifics felt excessive. Over-explaining slowed things down. The system rewarded brevity, precision without context. When memories surfaced, they did so indirectly, a pause, a hesitation, a sentence cut short. No one pressed for elaboration. Everyone had learned the same lesson. Saying less worked better. Silence didn't need enforcing. It had become efficient. Certain shifts stopped appearing in summaries. Not all of them. Not at once. They faded from monthly reviews, then from quarterly ones. Their absence didn't disrupt totals. Numbers still balanced. Coverage appeared complete. What disappeared wasn't labor. It was traceability. Without a record, the shifts stopped being discussable. Without discussion, they stopped being remembered. Without memory, they stopped being questioned. Erasure didn't look like deletion. It looked like completion. Nothing about the process felt rushed. That's what made it convincing. Forgetting happened slowly, professionally, without visible resistance. Each adjustment had a rationale. Each omission had a justification. Together, they formed something smoother than truth. No one announced the forgetting. It simply worked better that way. And because it worked, it stayed. The routines continued as if nothing had shifted. Lights turned on at the same time. Papers moved along the same paths. People passed each other with the same efficiency. Yet beneath the surface, something had changed. Not the environment, not the schedules, but the response of those inside it. Eyes that once scanned rooms for instructions now scanned for omission. Hands that once hesitated now moved without thought. Movements felt like anticipation rather than choice. And she noticed. Not fear, not anger, just attention. Something had passed into the fabric of daily life. Invisible, procedural, irreversible. The small inconsistencies, the missing records, the subtle adjustments, they remained. Nobody remarked on them. Nobody corrected them. Nobody seemed to notice they had noticed. The absence of reaction had weight. It was heavier than the presence of oversight. It pressed on memory and judgment alike, teaching compliance quietly, almost invisibly. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't approval. It was simply how things operated now. And she could not undo it. She remembered the first shift that vanished from the logbook. She remembered the document that never existed. She remembered the pause in procedure that never needed explaining. She could name them all in her mind. She could not name the reason. She could not name the decision. The system moved on, indifferent, seamless. The human traces remained. The moral weight remained. The questions remained unanswered. No one blamed anyone. No one was called to account. Everyone acted as if the environment were neutral, and yet everyone knew it was not. They followed steps. They avoided excess. They learned to notice without speaking. They learned to comply without instruction. And in that quiet observation, something like judgment began, not written anywhere, not enforced anywhere, just existing in glances and hesitations. The moral question didn't live in law or policy. It lived in habit, in silence, in human behavior itself. The room emptied, the papers stacked, the lights turned off. Nothing changed externally. Everything had changed internally. She walked through the space once more, noting the absence of action, the efficiency of compliance, the calm surface hiding unseen consequences. And then the question emerged, without voice, without answer. At what point does following instructions become the same as participating? At what point does silence replace responsibility? And if no one is blamed, does it still matter what was done?